I think this all began really about the time of Harry's marriage to Meghan. I mean, sort of much later in life, because up until that point, certainly up until the point of, their mother's death, they were very much at one.
Welcome to the latest episode of The Sun's new show, Royal Exclusive. I'm Matt Wilkinson, Royal Editor, and today we have a true gent. He had unrivalled access inside the royal family after serving as Princess Diana's bodyguard. He is retired inspector and best-selling author Ken Wharfe. Hi Ken, thank you for coming.
Well, that's a great intro. I mean, I'm a true gent. I like that. Thank you very much.
I added that in myself, actually. Yeah, I made that work.
Okay.
Now, you're obviously world famous, to be honest, for being Princess Diana's bodyguard. But what is often overlooked is how close you were to the boys, Harry and William, because you were close protection officer with William and Harry before you got the job with Diana. What are your memories of that unit, that family of three during the time that you were serving? I mean, you were quite close to William and Harry, or you spent a lot of time with them, I believe.
Yeah, what I remember most importantly is that, we're talking the mid-'80s here. This is all, pre-social media. It was a different time, a different ball game in that sense. But of course, my job was that I was recruited to set up the security for William's new school in North London called Wetherby. And at this point, I hadn't met any member of the royal family, and having sort of successfully passed all the training scenarios that one had to go through to get this job. I remember driving up to Sandringham House in Norfolk, where Diana and the Prince of Wales, as he was then, were on a holiday, a vacation. And I was there to meet Diana. And I remember being shown into this room at Sandringham, somewhat nervous at the prospect of seeing and meeting Diana and the two young princes. And as I was shown in, William was playing a piano, I might add, incredibly badly. And Harry was stood on a table like this, destamenising this vase of royal lilies. And once this very attentive butler had introduced me to Diana, she said, "I don't envy you, Ken, looking after my children. They can be a bloody nuisance." At which point William turned round from playing the piano and said, "I'm not a bloody nuisance," or anything else. And Harry said something similar, at which point he falls off the table, followed by this vase of lilies. And of course Diana gets up and says, "Come here," and chases them out of the room. And actually I hadn't said anything. But that sort of parental, motherly approach sort of really set the scene for me, because when Diana returned, it was actually like seeing somebody you'd known for a long, long time. And, in that process, she sort of broke the ice. And that was my introduction to Diana, their mother, and working for the royal family. And from there on, actually, life was very, very enjoyable, I have to say that.
What were the boys like when they were young then, at the time that you spent with them? Was there any sense, I mean, Harry's mentioned in Spare about, how he often felt that there was friction between him and his older brother as they grew up, and that William would get preferential treatment. But what was your feeling spending so much time with the two princes? With their personalities, for instance, back then in the 80s, what were they like?
Well, but actually, in the 80s, that time, when they were aged 5 and 3 respectively, and although I actually left them after a period of 6 months, I was still very much involved within their life cycle, in terms of that, of course, Diana would take them to school. It was a very happy unit. It was a very happy family. I mean, what I will say is that, Diana and her husband at that time were going through a very difficult period of their life. But both of them, didn't want their, situation to be known by the children. Of course not. And actually, they knew they had a blissful, happy life at that point. But Harry was always the joker, the entertainer, and I suppose really it would be quite common really for the sort of sibling rivalry that there was for the eldest William to be slightly nervous or envious of Harry because he was so popular. But he was the entertainer. You could almost say he was the court jester at that time, and so in that sense, I think William found it slightly different. But they were funny. What I liked about Diana, what I liked about, the prince himself, the way that they educated their children, albeit in rather extreme privileged circumstances. They had a very, very good upbringing in that sense. And Diana was very careful to, and sort of insisted that they had a normal life. You know, she'd take them to burger bars. You know, I remember Bill Wyman, Sticky Fingers in Ken High Street, was a favourite of theirs. And, you know, she openly encouraged, you know, sort of tea with their own peer group and so forth. And likewise, friends would come back to Kensington Palace. So in that sense, there was a normality there. But no, I just witnessed an upbringing that was about as normal as you were going to get within, you know, the confines of a royal family. I mean, one thing that Diana didn't want, she wanted her children to go to a normal school. Well, you could argue that Weatherby probably not normal, it was a fee-paying pre-preparatory. But that was about the best that Diana could get. There was no way he was going to go to the local comprehensive, although that might have been a good idea. But you know, it was a fun time, no doubt about that.
But knowing what you knew, knowing what we know now, the brothers don't speak. Was there any indication when you were working with them that there was this kind of sibling rivalry that would end up in a situation where two previously close brothers are basically sworn enemies?
No, I think there's this sort of breakup of sibling relationship. I think this all began really about the time of Harry's marriage to Meghan. I mean, sort of much later in life, because up until that point, certainly up until the point of, you know, their mother's death, you know, they were very much at one. I mean, you know, they entertained each other. They were very much involved in each other's friends. You know, but again, right through that early part of the life, you know, Harry was always the most popular. But to be fair to Diana and their father, you know, there was never any preference shown. I mean, they were treated, you know, very fairly. I remember one incident actually going down to Highgrove one weekend, which was a normal Friday night journey. And they clearly had an argument in the nursery beforehand. And as we came out of the front doors of Kensington Palace, there's the nanny, the late Olga Powell, who was, you know, an incredibly interesting nanny of the old school. And, you know, would dish out, you know, very gentle corporal punishment. And clearly Harry and William had a barn, as I say. They get in the car, and Diana sort of said, "Look, if you carry on like this, we're not going. You know, we stay in London. If you could just behave like this, we're not going anywhere." And I think we're halfway down the M4, and they started again. And there's Olga sat in the middle of the back seat, refereeing this argument. And then suddenly Harry turns across to William. He said, "It's all right for you," he said. "You'll be king one day and you can do what you want. And furthermore," he said, "I'll do what I want." And I looked at Diana, I was in the front seat, and she looked at me and she said, "Where the hell did he get that from?" And, you know, it was funny, but I always thought interesting that children at that age, that he could have a thought process at that age to say to his brother, who he knew would be king, and William thought, you know, he knew he would be king at some point. We're talking about a 6, 7-year-old talking to his brother 4 or 5. But anyway, we didn't go back to London, but quite interesting.
Mm. What do you think? So Diana was sat in the car with you, and she was listening to the two boys talk about that. How do you think? Is it impossible to say? But how do you think Diana would feel knowing that these two previously close brothers are basically at war?
Yeah, I think the sad thing is that you know, of Diana's death. Now, that was a traumatic experience, certainly for them. You know, they lose their mother so publicly. And in Harry's particular case, as I think it was a 13, 14-year-old, he is, out of a sense of duty, has to sort of walk behind his mother's coffin to Westminster Abbey, which is a discussion in itself.
Well, you were there, weren't you, actually, at the...
I was at Westminster Abbey, and I remember, you know, the coffin arriving with Harry having walked nearly a mile through the royal mile, as it were, to Westminster Abbey. But up until that point, and I think even after that point, they remain good friends. And I think that, to answer your question, how would Diana have influenced, you know, or had any influence on resolving their issues in later life? I think she would have been, because what this turmoil needed, or needs even now, I think, is someone to convene and try and sort this out. And it's never going to be sorted out publicly. It has to be sorted out privately. I think his father, the king, is desperate to resolve this issue, because I think it's very important for him. But coming back to how would Diana resolve that? Because Diana knew that William and Harry, probably better than anybody else, would have understood the problems, would have seen the issues surrounding the complications with Harry and Meghan and all that sort of had with it at the time. Although in 2017, Harry's marriage to Meghan was probably the greatest thing that ever happened to the British royal family. He had a prince of the realm marrying into a woman of mixed race, a divorcee herself, and an American. And this was all supported, by the Queen, by the establishment. And sadly, it all went horribly wrong. I do think in that sense that Diana, if she were alive, would have seen all the complications, and et cetera, the complexities of that, knowing how royalty works, would have been a great motivator to try and resolve that issue, which I'm sure she would have done.
Obviously, the wedding, Harry and Meghan. Do you think Diana would obviously have been delighted by Meghan? Do you think she would have welcomed Meghan? Do you think they would have been close, Diana and Meghan, with similar personalities? Or?
Diana would have loved it because it was risque anyway. The very fact that her son was marrying a divorcee, an American, an actress, an actor, whatever. This was all sort of food for Diana's discussion. And, of course she would have liked it. She was always totally supportive, always said that the most important issues in my life are my children. And for that reason would have supported them and would have been a great advisor. And let's not forget, that great day at Windsor, at St. George's Chapel, the Queen herself had effectively given over this piece of royal history to the great gospel choir. And then we had the visiting US priest that sort of went way beyond his allotted time, much to the entertainment of the king and other people within the congregation. So this would have been very entertaining for Diana. But I do think that, one of her qualities was her humane touch, and would have seen the problems that were likely to come out of that marriage. And, where we are now with him and his wife and a family domiciled in the US, Diana would have been, a frequent visitor and would now, to this day, in my view, even work with her ex-husband, the king, to find a way to best resolve this issue. Because that's what it needs. It can now not be dealt with within the media. It has to be dealt with privately.
I remember there was talk about Princess Diana wanting to maybe move to America herself when she was alive. She was quite a maverick. And I think in your book, Diana Closely Guarded Secret, it's not a memory test about your book, so I've written a little piece down. I think you described her as a heroine who broke free of royal bonds and changed the monarchy. Would she have supported Megxit? Would she have supported Harry saying to the royal family, "I don't want any of this. I'm taking my family abroad"? Or would she have looked at it as a bit of a betrayal to the institution that she still did love, despite all her problems?
I think what Diana would have been ahead of the game, and ahead of Harry's meeting with the late Queen in the sense, because she would have known exactly, what Queen Elizabeth would say. I mean, as we know, the Queen understood completely the problems that Harry and Meghan were experiencing. They wanted, they found the press an intrusion, they found the media intrusion, they valued their privacy. He couldn't find a way in the United Kingdom at that time, so therefore decided that he would leave. But he didn't realise at that point that the Queen was going to say, "Fine, we understand, but you can't have it both ways. You can't do a 6 month in, a 6 month out. We don't work like that. The monarchy has been running for hundreds of years. Suddenly to break out of that tradition wasn't going to work." Now, Diana would have anticipated that is exactly what the Queen would have said, and in that sense would have said, "Well, look, you've got to be careful here. I understand," but I think it would have been easier had his mother been around, because the one thing that I think that Harry has lacked in the last 4 or 5 years, or the last 4 years, is real personal advice from close members of his family. And I think that's been part of the problem. I was always critical of perhaps some of the advice he's taken from outside of the royal family. I mean, notably, his book, Spare, I mean, we touched on it. It was always going to be a global bestseller because, no one member of the recent British royal family has written such a memoir. But, there were things that made the headlines in that publication were things that perhaps shouldn't have been included. His sort of early sexual activities in a pub garden in Gloucestershire, or the sort of the egoistic sort of line of, killing Afghans in his war in Afghanistan, because that, in essence, sort of produced a great deal of negative publicity. I think he tells a very convincing story about his life, which is of interest. But I think what he lacked was the proper advisor. And to come back to the beginning, Matt, I think this is where Diana would have been very influential.
In your experience, the claims that Harry has made about the royal family in Spare and on these TV shows where him and Meghan have both talked about racism, they've both talked about, or institutional racism rather than, they've kind of diluted their allegations recently, and talked about, a childhood. Harry paints a childhood where he kind of felt unloved by his father, and talks about breaking this cycle of pain. That's why he moved his family across. In your experience, when you were, as I say, so tight within the royal family, seeing them every single day, are the accusations that he made, is there any reality in that from your experience?
These are very serious statements to make on his part. I mean, from my part, working not only with Diana and William and Harry, I've worked with every single member of the royal family over 16 years, and I've never saw one hint of racism. Because they're not. The royal family are not racist. They represent the very best, in my view. I'm not saying they're perfect, but on this particular subject, no, they're not. And, quite what happened in Harry's case when, Archie was born, one can imagine a variety of discussions and leads within the royal family. But I wasn't there, so I'm not in a position to say what was said or what wasn't said. But in those discussions, I'm convinced that there was nothing with any real racial intent. And I think for that reason, this is where we come back to the advisors again, and people that are close to him, to say, well, hang on a minute, you know her, you know him, you know your father, you know that's not the case. So I think, again, it's a delicate subject for discussion. But personally, from my own experiences, I never witnessed any of it. On the contrary, I mean, it's not within their remit, their royal role. I mean, it's they want to embrace, a wider, society from all races. That's exactly what their role is. So I don't see that.
Fine. Now, as we've touched on a lot, you were, Princess Diana's bodyguard and for a short period of time, but also William and Harry's bodyguard. There's been a big court case. Prince Harry has taken the Home Office to court. He wants you. He wants someone like you. He wants a royal protection officer when he's in the UK.
Well, I'm not been approached. I'm open.
Would you do it?
Well, I'd love you to give advice on it. I mean, I'm probably too old now to do the job itself. But
the court case itself. I mean. He wants someone, not specifically you, but he wants a Royal Protection Officer team when he's here in the UK, when he brings his family. And I think we discussed this before in the past, but is it a case of that he will get proper security and he is safe if he comes here, knowing what you know?
Yeah, again, this is an unusual case that sadly he's now £750,000 to £1 million out of pocket as a result of this. And I think when you look at this case, it was never going to win in favour for him. And so, it goes back to the very question that we talked about earlier, Matt, that, who actually advised him to take this course of action? Yes, it becomes very much a celebrity event because it involves him, the question of protection. He's saying that his family need the protection because of what happened to his mother. I mean, here's a wide subject for discussion. But the most important thing here is that this government and the Metropolitan Police would never, ride away or abandon him coming to the United Kingdom, because they know, although whatever the risk assessment would be, they would have a duty, because of who he is and the connections with his father, the king of this country, to provide him with some sort of protection, and I know that's the case. They would provide him with a liaison officer to work in conjunction with his own security, to enable him to have access into places, government buildings, say, or royal palaces where, restriction is obviously, there's a restriction there. So he was never going to be left alone. And so in that sense, I was surprised again that he continued to pursue this action, because as a non-working member of the British royal family, living on the other side of the United States of America, I don't see how any one person can justify him giving the team that he wanted of, let's say, at least a team of 4 protection officers with access to a close protection team. That's just not acceptable. Acceptable on the grounds that it's not required. And secondly, it's not acceptable on the grounds of the cost to the public purse. And the judge found that in favour of that was the case. And equally, the government and the police have supported that action. But I think what Harry must realise is that he will never be left completely unprotected. He will always have somebody there to look after his best interest. And that is what he should have accepted.
Yeah, I mean, he's appealing, isn't he? So he's appealing this case, but I think you're right. I think potentially.
Well, I don't know where the appeal's likely to go. I mean, I cannot see that appeal being overruled. The only way that is for him to be guaranteed a full protection package, if he suddenly strikes up a deal with his father and says, "Well, look, Pa, we're coming home," because that moves on to the next subject. Because he is very much, or was very much, probably still is, very much part of his father's vision of the new monarchy. Before he abandoned the UK and went to the United States of America, he was part of this sort of threesome, this triangle, to move the monarchy forward in a new direction. Sadly, the king has lost 1/3 of that now. And I don't think for one moment that he would not welcome that back if, there can be an agreement, if there is, a reversal of Harry. Now, I don't know whether he's coming back. I don't think anybody knows. But my guess is that that there will be a resolution one way or the other. And I think there's every chance that he might come back. In what format, I don't know.
Well, I think people would like to see the family. People would like to see the children, or Charles's grandchildren. They'd like to think that they're able to be brought over. So if there was some kind of resolution, it would be. We would like the family to I think Sun readers would like the family to kind of be reunited if they could come to some kind of agreement. And security is such an important thing. I'm told he's obsessed about it. It's such an important thing.
Well, I can understand that. I mean, he's made reference to what happened to his mother in 1997. And unfortunately, he's been at the behest of, in my opinion, some pretty shoddy protection within the United States. I mean, that sort of wacky car chase through New York should never have been the case. That was a case of, again, being annoyed with the pursuing paparazzi. Well, I've always maintained it's a crazy idea to start a journey of running through any street in any city in the world trying to lose the paparazzi, because that never works. But then they're not going to kill you. So you've got to strike up a deal with these people. You've got to work a way around it so you come out on top, rather at the end, sort of grinding to a halt in the back streets of New York. He must have felt pretty sick about that. But that's maybe not his fault, but, I can see his problem. But coming back, to what might happen, his father now is undergoing treatment for an undiagnosed cancer. He's not an insensitive man, Harry, and he will be very worried about that. Of course he would be. And I think that he is now going to look to find a way, I think, to bring his wife, whether she comes or not, and certainly his children, to see his father, not knowing quite, what the diagnosis is or what it will bring. So I think all these things will play quite an important role in Harry's decision to return to the UK on a permanent or a semi-permanent basis. But a lot has been said, but I don't think it's an irresolvable problem.
Oh, okay, interesting. But you're not volunteering to do it, obviously, Ken.
Well, I'd be very happy to advise Harry. I mean, I spent a lot of time with him as a young kid, as you know, and I say I like them. Of course, who wouldn't dislike them? But that was a long time ago. But my experiences of working with them were tremendous. Just one story that I always remember with William and Harry. This was on a trip to Necker Island in the British Virgin Islands, courtesy of Richard Branson. How lucky were they? I mean, how lucky was I to go on that? Not once, but twice. But I remember the manager returned from nearby Tortola one day with all the supplies. And William was there on the sort of quay in the pontoon with Harry. And he said in a very broad American-Canadian accent, he said, I've got you a gift, mate. And produced these 2 large catapults, they're sort of inch-thick catapults with a big pouch in it. And I said, so William said, in that sort of just William way, he said, I tell you what, Harry, we can fix these catapults on the cliff top, and we can fill it with water balloons. And when Mummy gives a press photograph, and we're getting quite excited about this, on the beach, we can fire the balloons at the press. And I said, no, that's not a good idea, William. Within seconds, Diana came down and said, Ken, I think it's a very good idea what William and Harry are going to do. So the following day, I remember briefing the late James Whittaker at nearby Byrus Creek. And I said, listen, look, you've got 10 minutes, to photograph Diana, her mother, her brothers, her sisters. And actually, Whittaker was beside himself with Kent Gavin and all these other well-known snappers at the time. And then the following morning, this flotilla of boats arrived at this beach, and Diana walked down to the beach in this sort of leopard skin swimming costume, whatever, and minus Harry and William and his cousins. And I remember James Whittaker stood up in the boat and said, where are the children? And at that point, you hear this shout, fire! And this salvo of brightly coloured water balloons came off this cliff top, and one hit Whittaker in the chest. And I've never forgotten, he stood up. Of course, Diana and her family just found this one of the most entertaining things I think they've experienced in their life, that their 2 children and their cousins had actually sort of invaded and attacked the British media. And Whittaker stood up and said, I've just been slayed by the future King of England. So out of this, there were some great fun times, and that was just one of them.
Well, that's the thing. It's like we want, I think Sun readers and people actually want the brothers to kind of be reunited, and they like to listen to those stories of happy days when they were children. It's quite warm to know that, although they're not talking at the moment, they shared so much, didn't they? And you got to witness all of it.
Yeah, but to this day, Matt, I don't know exactly what the problem is, or was, or still is. I don't know. I think William's, he's not unintelligent. He knows the situation. He knows that it's right, seriously right, for them to find a way of, getting back together again. If not only, as I discussed a moment, for their father's sake, but I think it's important for them. So I do think that there's a way forward. But the only way, as I said, and I keep repeating myself, is for them to get round the table and resolve it. Because otherwise there'll be speculation upon speculation about this, and it'll rumble on. And I just think that the general public, quite frankly, have just about had enough of it.
Fine. Well, listen, Ken, we went out for lunch a couple of weeks ago, and I know that me and you could probably talk for about 2 or 3 hours about.
Have I gone on too long?
Memories. No, perfect.
Okay. There's so much. I mean, it's an interesting family, and the royal family is interesting. One of the things that I found about working with them for so many years is that, apart from the privilege and the places I was very happy to go to, the one thing I was always impressed with, particularly with Diana and our present king, was their generosity, not only to us, the police, but to their staff generally. And I don't think for one moment that has changed. So, I think on that side of it, and also given, the unhappiness of, the parents within that relationship, William and Harry never suffered as a result of their unhappiness. And I think that is a credit to both of them. It was a sad marriage in that sense, and all of the problems were being played out in the national media. That's not many people experience that. But as I say, underneath all that, their individual generosity and kindness, certainly to those that work for them, I said has to be admired. So for that, I'm incredibly grateful.
Excellent. Well, yeah, what a lovely chat. And there's probably loads and loads and loads more you can.
Well, you've got to get me back, Matt.
We're going to get you back.
Yeah,
and we're going to have an extended version, and we'll go through some more stories about Harry and William when they were children, which I know there's loads of good stories in your book as well, so I appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt. Brilliant.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate you coming on. That's everything for today. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. If you've got this far, then you must have found it interesting. But if you want to hear or see more Royal news like this, then please subscribe and click below. Thank you very much.